Hello again. We are here at the panel about trust and digital society. The next panel is about the European role in the world in terms of policy, culture, and sort of identity that Europe has in terms of its contribution to how we regulate ourselves in the digital society. The previous panel argued that for having a trustable ecosystem, we also need regulations that are aligned, that don't contain incoherence, which is pretty difficult given the fact that this is such a complex subject. So how Ivo Volman, head of the Data Policy and Innovation Unit of DG Connect at the European Commission, will help us understand how regulation is in Europe is conceived and what's the vision.
Many thanks, Luca, and good afternoon to all. So I'm very happy to be at this timely event. Data ethics is a topic that's close to my heart. And I'm responsible for the Open Data Directive, for the Data Governance Act and the Data Act that were just mentioned. So some big legislative instruments that we have on the table. But let me start from another document that the Commission has put on the table at the end of January this year, which is the Declaration on European Digital Rights and Principles. Now, this declaration establishes a framework for a sustainable and human-centric vision for the digital transformation of Europe. It can be seen in a way as a social contract for the digital world. And the framework is built on 6 pillars: people at the center, inclusion, sustainability, participation, freedom of choice, and security in the online environment. Now, the protection of personal data and also giving individuals control over the way data is being used, there are central elements in this document. And this is really about a European way of dealing with data, right? It's our way. It's not the Chinese way. It's not the US way. This is the European way of dealing with data. It's about the ethical collection, processing, and use of data, which is also critical. We heard it from the last panel, for ensuring trust in the data ecosystem. And that in turn is essential for the willingness of people to actually make data available, to share data. Now, therefore, it's also one of the key elements of our European strategy for data that we published in February 2020. And what is the vision behind this strategy? The vision is that data can flow between countries, but also between sectors. The vision is that there's ample of data available for use, but that data use is being done in full respect with European values, including privacy, including data protection. And last but not least, that there are clear rules in place for who actually can use what data under what conditions. Now, we have chosen a model where individuals can really play an active role in deciding who can do what with the data. And you will see that later in a moment in the data instruments. So what we want is that the fundamental rights and values are really respected in the digital sphere as they are respected in the physical world. And this is also reflected in actually the research projects that we are funding. And we heard some examples before, privacy enhancing technologies, for example, but it's also very present in the legislative proposals that we have put on the table in the last 2 years. So the Data Governance Act and the Data Act, they're really the key tools to materialize the vision that I just expressed. Now, overall, they're about creating the conditions for more data sharing, better data use, and I will give some examples from these instruments. So the Data Governance Act, it was actually already agreed by the Parliament and Council in just one year. And the Data Governance Act introduces the concept of data altruism. It makes it possible and easier for individuals and companies who want to share their data or donate their data to do so in a trusted ecosystem. If I have a rare disease and I decide that I want to share my data about the disease, I can do that. And I know the organizations I'm sharing with can be trusted. If I want to share my travel data to be used for improving the local infrastructure, I can do that. And the Data Governance Act is one of its elements is making a better basis for that kind of data sharing. Now, let me move then to the Data Act. It was mentioned before, the proposal is 2 weeks old. That is really about the fair attribution of value of data. So it's in the interest of empowering consumers who are actually generating the data, because things used to be so clear. You bought an object and the object was yours and everything that came with it was yours. But how does that work for data and objects that produce data? What can the manufacturer do with the data? What can you do with the data? Should you have certain control over that? That's what the Data Act is essentially looking into. Who can do what with the data that is generated in this kind of situations? And another element, an interesting element in the Data Act, are the rules for access by the public sector to private sector data for the common good. Now, we've seen the need for data, including mobility data that was highlighted before, in emergency situations, like in the COVID situations. And the Data Act puts in place a mechanism for the public sector to get private sector data, not by reporting obligations and not by buying the data, but a different way when there are real needs to get the data. Now, a few concluding remarks. Sometimes data ethics and in particular privacy elements are pitched against data use. Now, I don't share that view at all. I think that data ethics and data use are really two faces of the same medal. They're about a conscious and proactive way of handling data. So we should not just let things go, but decide how we in Europe want to handle data, combining a high degree of data ethics with, at the same time, a high degree of data use possibilities. Now, a last thought about the ethical implications of not using the data. Data will allow us to live longer and healthier lives. It will make it possible to save people in emergency situations. So could inaction on data actually be an ethical question and an ethical issue, as much as the question on how we are actually using the data in an ethical way? So perhaps I leave that one to Jeroen also to answer.
Yeah, and that's a super interesting question too. We have the possibility to discuss this in terms of ethics, which means something that is inside the designing of technology, but also the use of technology and the way we educate ourselves to technology. Jeroen van der Hoven, professor of ethics at Technical University of Delft, help us understand how we move in this labyrinth.
Yes. If you allow me to take the control over some of the slides I would like to see. I don't see a button where I can do that. Yep. It is a very interesting question that Ivo just put on the table, and I think it should be answered by it. Sometimes it is morally blameworthy not to make good use of the data and not to make them similar to a thank you, medical professional who refuses to run certain tests or use let's say radio diagnostic apparatus. And sometimes when this machinery is available, you have an obligation to use it, and you would be negligible if negligent, if you wouldn't. So a couple of slides. So I was announced as the chair of the European Group on Ethics of the European Commission. We're just entered a new mandate, and no chair has yet been appointed. So that is a little bit early in the day to do that. So I'm a permanent member of the European Group on Ethics, and as such, in the previous mandate, I was the rapporteur for the AI statement on robotics and autonomous technology. It's good to see that the colleagues are still all in Brussels are all on the same page. We're all really on the same page with this. But my talk is just to show that how incredibly high the stakes are right now. And so it's a little bit more kind of an overview of that. I think, and the previous speakers have indicated that there are two major threats to a thinking about a responsible digital future as seen from Brussels. First of all, political regimes that do not share our value frameworks, don't buy into human rights, fundamental rights, the rule of law and democracy, and then these corporate actors that also have higher other preferences, especially with respect to quarterly revenues and profit maximization instead of the interests of European citizens. And so we know who they are. We know the business model that has been described thus far. We also know that we have in Brussels a position to take arms against them, and we have some very competent people who already have done so. And has been referred to, this is not just haphazard and a little bit of this and a little bit of that ad hoc work. This is part of a really thorough, and Ivo has mentioned it, a thorough and well thought through legal framework that will help us to migrate into a responsible digital future in Europe. Now, as far as the state actors are concerned, welcome to a multipolar world, and the last 2 weeks have pointed this out in a very terrible way. It is very important to bear in mind that digital technologies play a very important role here. China, Russia, and the US and Europe, we can't do all the wonderful things that we need to do and that we cannot do without digital technologies and integrating these different sectors and subsystems in society: banking and finance, military, education, healthcare, transport and logistics, etc. And these technologies are not neutral. We know since a couple of decades that artifacts come with politics. Artifacts have inscribed politics, and every little bit of it, the ontologies, the coding, the interfaces, everything has values inscribed into it, and we need to be aware of that. It's very much true, as Churchill said. We shape our buildings, we shape our digital house, and thereafter we become like that house. We inherit the properties that we have given to it. Technologies are not value neutral, and values are of consequence. So they will be implemented. And it has been referred to also. The US has a completely different model. It's very much like our model, but it has a different model of man. A different view on regulation. It has a Silicon Valley can-do mentality, move fast, break things first, and apologize later. China wants to replace human rights by social harmony. It's socialism with Chinese characteristics. Sharp power, party rule, massive surveillance and control are not a taboo. Perhaps something to be admired. Social scoring technologies, all the things that in the AI Act we have said there's a red line there. Russia is a very strange bird here, as we have seen. I'm still trying to get my head around what that model is and how it should be characterized, but it's definitely different, markedly different, and it is a bit of a geopolitical threat, I would say. Europe, human rights foregrounded, fundamental rights, as has been highlighted by the previous speakers, but a conception of the person as autonomous, for whom freedom, autonomy, and human dignity are very important, and they are respected by the political systems. In Brussels, this is now characterized as a tension that has been building up systemic rivals are confronting each other, and the arena in which they fight, an important arena, is the digital domain, is digital society. So where is is Europe going? Are we going to be the museum of the world, or are we also maybe the cradle of the second enlightenment? We were the cradle of the first one, so why not the second one? It's very wise of the European Commission to point out, let's just focus on what is important for us, right? So we know what we're doing. We know that the European foundations are important for us, so we have to shape that digital future in accordance with them. And Macron has, I think, seen it very early on. There's a third way, there's a fourth way, depending on how many systemic rivals you see, but it's AI for humanity, and it needs to be done by design, right? So it needs to be inserted into the technology early on. It's good to see that the European Commission kind of shares this completely, wholeheartedly. So responsible innovations is making good use. And we have, as Ivo pointed out, I think a moral obligation to make good use of it for the well-being of our citizens, but while respecting these very fundamental ethical and legal principles. And that can give rise to a kind of a beneficial spiral upwards instead of a Delaware kind of spiral down. This is a Brussels effect. And Paul Nimitz has said, I think also correctly, is a top legal advisor of the European Commission, if we want to protect and strengthen Western liberal democracies in the age of AI and the core Trinitarian idea of human rights, rule of law, and democracy, we need to do this by design. We need a new culture of doing this by design. And so therefore we have to invest in that. And the European Commission, and Ivo has also referred to that, is putting its money where its mouth is. It already did under the previous framework program, Horizon 2020, in the form of responsible innovation and research. But these are the issues that we are confronted with. So what is fairness? What is openness? What is transparency? And then suddenly we dig into it, and it turns out we have 20, 25, 30 different definitions of this. So we need to do our homework. We need to do ethical homework in order to carve out how we want to define it, where we want to place our investments, and also in terms of R&D. So the European Group on Ethics has recently published a statement. I was the rapporteur for that, and a key idea is this responsible innovation. This is our success. That is what we need to do. We cannot do without it, and we have to design for our values, and we have to make our ethics work. We really have to show how this works for the European citizens. And if we don't do it consciously, systematically, responsibly, methodically, others will do it for us. They will do it haphazardly, insidiously, and self-servingly. And so humane AI, Claire, so big data, and I'm very happy with the colleagues who are working in this project, is just a wonderful example of how we can experiment and develop all of these technologies designed for European values. And they have been mentioned by Josep Domingo and by Francesca Partesi and by Giovanni. And there's an incredible amount of very good work done here. And we need to see more of this, because in Europe, I think we need to now in the next decade show how our ethics really can work.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's the So Big Data Consortium, 31 different institutions working together and aligning their way to design technology is really a very special model for producing technology. It's a very European way to do it, with a sort of standardization culture in mind, and an open approach, scientific approach. It's super interesting. In terms of regulation, I very much appreciated Ivo Volman starting by mentioning the declaration, which is a sort of description of the society we would like to build. When we go to regulation, then we need to understand, and people is always complaining about the following. Is the regulation from the Commission too general and abstract, or too particular and detailed, in order to have the right balance and help innovation without blocking it. This is the general discussion about the regulation. I would also like to add to this question an idea. We always understand why technological companies make mistakes, because we trust that they will fix it later and fast. Why don't we are not able to think the same for innovative, very innovative regulation that deals with very complex systems? Why cannot we have a sort of do it and then adjust it fast later?
Let me react to that, Luca, if you want, indeed. Now, the dilemma of being general or being too specific, right? I mean, well, we hope we got it right with the Data Act. The Data Act wants to be a horizontal framework that applies across all the different sectors, right? And it gives the possibility for sectors to actually complement with very sector-specific elements. For example, if you talk about cars producing data, there may be very specific elements that are only relevant for cars, but are not so relevant for smart dishwashers or for other smart objects, robots in factories, for example. So what we have tried to do with the Data Act is indeed to get the abstraction level right, where we really make a difference, but where we also saw that being too specific and imposing certain rules on all the different sectors that may be very specific, including definitions of what type of APIs you need to use, or including very specific interoperability rules that would apply across the board, that would create a problem in terms of the investments in the data producing objects. So there we really paid a lot of attention to get that balance right. And still, some people will say it's too generic, and other people will say it's actually too specific, and we will get the discussion in the Parliament and Council. Now, there, should we move ahead with innovation regulation much faster at the risk of getting it wrong? And there, I'm not too sure actually, because the risk of getting it wrong is big. And if you get it wrong, it's very difficult to get it repaired. So I would rather take a bit more time to get our legislation in a proper shape, to get it fully coherent also with what is there already, and to build on what is there already, rather than to rush. And what I'm actually quite, well, in a way surprised to see is that the very complex way of making legislation in Europe, it really works. It really works to have all the member states involved in these discussions and go into a very detailed technical discussion in the council working groups, and then going up to the Council of Ministers. And at the same time, having the European Parliament also working on the same text, sometimes with from a more political angle, but also looking very much into the details. And bringing these two perspectives, where the Parliament normally takes a more European perspective and the member states take a more national perspective, bringing these two strands together does lead to solid legislation that has been thought through. And of course, we put a lot of work in getting the balance right when we make the proposal as a European Commission. But then getting into discussion with member states and the Parliament really adds value to that and leads to solid compromises. That's what I see happening.
Thank you. Professor van den Hoven, I would like to ask you the opposite question. Is it ethic for private companies to slow down innovation and think before they do things that could be dangerous?
I think it's very important, and it's gradually an accepted business practice. So we have for decades we've had the discussions about corporate social responsibility, and now every company is invited and also actually actively involved in considering what they can contribute to, for example, attaining the UN Sustainable Development Goals, whether that is on an international or on a national or regional or local level. So it's almost irresponsible to just, without thinking, what you're producing and what you're putting on the market will help to achieve in society in terms of those grand challenges. So yeah. So I think this is becoming also in light of the climate change crisis that we're going through and many other crises that we have to urgently address, and we have a whole list of 170 of those internationally accepted things that we need to achieve before 2030. It's irresponsible not to take this into account and just to start producing and developing fairly frivolous products and services. So I think this is becoming part and parcel of entrepreneurship and of business and industry. So that's good. And of course, they have asked for regulation themselves very often. They said, well, help us to create a level playing field so that we don't stand alone, but we can confront these challenges together, and we have a level playing field. And that's exactly what Europe is doing. So that I agree with Ivo that is working. Don't forget that we have really had some successes in sustainability, but also in the digital space with GDPR. Creating global standards by European law. We know that international law is terribly soft and inarticulate, but European law has a little bit more bite. And if we can make progress there, then others who are interested in an interesting market of 700 million customers, they will have to comply with what we have put out there.
Yeah, Professor, it's really one of the big chances that Europe can have for demonstrating the Brussels effect to be something important, as you mentioned before. It's a question of soft power, and so I will ask the last question to Mr. Volman, because it comes from the audience. So I'm happy to put it to ask this. The audience asked, what instruments can Europe propose to combat Russian propaganda?
Wow, that's a tricky one. Now, obviously, we have our actions on disinformation, a network of fact checkers and other actions to actually combat disinformation. Now, what can we do more at this moment in time? I can tell you that my colleagues are working full time on that. It's actually not a file that I'm controlling, but using the networks that we have built up to stop disinformation, following the money, and making sure that this information doesn't pay off. That's already being done structurally. I can also tell you that the colleagues are in touch with the large companies that have services that sometimes are used for disinformation, that are very direct contacts, and that we do everything that's necessary to stop the disinformation. That doesn't mean that the flow of disinformation stops immediately, because of course you always have to balance and make a balance between, on the one hand, what is a free expression of what you think and what is disinformation. So in our European democracies, that's what we do. We make that weighting, and we make sure that free speech is not is not stopped. But at the same time, the levels of disinformation that are being spread are horrendous, and we do take our action there.
I think if I just can add just 2 seconds, 2 seconds is that it's very important not only to a two-pronged approach is needed. So not only just to deal with the mis and disinformation and the trolling, etc., but also to experiment with new forms of digitally enabled democracy. So we see, fortunately, a lot of them. We need to give them a shot in the arm. I think the Commission needs to also invest in, how can we now finally, after 20, 30 years of promises, how democracy will benefit from the digital technologies, how can we really make that work as well?
Thank you very much, both of you. We are going fast to the next panel. I guess everybody has understood how important were the information you gave us. And let's go ahead with another panel about the role of ethics and the European data strategy.